how to do business in Canada. So, you know, as I mentioned in the introduction, I've been helping companies for over 15 years now to do business here. So I know, I think a great deal about that, and I'll be very happy to share that with you and with your member in the future. So first, to do business in Canada, one of the possible stages to create a business. So you have two ways to create a business in Canada. Either you can incorporate, so and I'm just going to, for definition purposes, when I'm going to say create a business, it's really create a subsidiary, but you create a subsidiary or you create a company in Canada, it doesn't make any difference. So just for ease of communication, I'm going to say create a business. But please understand that it fully applies to creating a subsidiary. So you have two options to incorporate a company in Canada. Either you incorporate your company at the federal level or you incorporate your company at the provincial level. So what are the differences? In terms of doing business on a daily basis, there is no differences. You can incorporate at the federal level, incorporate at the provincial level, you will still be able to do business everywhere in Canada. One of the only difference is that, let's say you incorporate in Ontario and then you open a branch and you hire someone in British Columbia, you're going to have to open what we call an extra-provincial branch in British Columbia, mainly to be able to pay the salary of that person. But beyond that, and beyond the fact that you need to have a branch where you have people who work and reside, it doesn't really matter where you're incorporated. So how you make the choice? So basically, when you incorporate at the federal level, you have the obligation to have one of the director or at least 25% of the director who are Canadian resident. Meaning that if nobody in your company, nobody in the partners or in the ownership is a resident of Canada, that means you need to bring on board a director who's Canadian. So that, you know, can create some difficulties. It's highly feasible, but it can create some difficulties. So our recommendation is to incorporate at the provincial level. And all the provinces are not doing the same thing. That will be too easy. So for some province, you need to have a Canadian resident as a director. For other, you don't, and can be 100% owned and operated by an ownership in Europe. So typically, when we help companies to come to Canada, we either incorporate in Quebec, or in Ontario or in BC, because those three provinces do not require any Canadian resident being a director. Just for you to know, in Ontario, this is fairly new, and it's only since June 2021 that you can incorporate without a Canadian director, Canadian resident as a director. So that's, yeah, fairly new. It's just a year now. Sorry, I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. Yes, so yeah, one thing that's pretty important in Europe, and I don't know what happened in every single of your countries, but I know that in some European countries, having a capital is very important to be able to show that your company is strong because you use it to communicate on your different commercial and financial documents. So please note that in Canada, a lot of companies, well, first of all, please understand that in Canada, there is no obligation except if you're on the exchange market, but otherwise there is no obligation to publish any financial information, meaning that it's very difficult here to find what are the revenues of a company, what are the profits. You don't have access to any financial figures in any public database. And so nobody really communicates on that subject. And so having a big capital just for the sake of saying, hey, look, I'm a strong company, you can trust me, has really not a lot of interest. And a lot of companies, unless they need it for purpose of business, but a lot of companies otherwise have only a social capital of $1. So that's a big difference that you need to understand. I just want to go back on what I mentioned about subsidiary for European companies, and just to clarify that a European company can have 100% ownership of a Canadian subsidiary. And most of the companies we've helped along the years, that's the model they have. Sometimes you have some, models that are a bit more complicated, where there is a holding in Europe, that holding owns the company, and then that holding is going to own the subsidiary as well. And so there is no direct connection between the European company and the Canadian company. So you just have to be careful with that situation when it comes to immigration of employees, because if there is a direct contact between a direct relation between the European company and the Canadian subsidiary, it's very easy to transfer employees. As long as the employee has been with the company for over a year, it's very easy to transfer. If there is no connection, it's a little bit more challenging, because the employee, if he's not employee of the holding but employee of the company, doesn't have that easy path. So when it's time to create a company, just to make sure your member understands that if part of the project there is some transfer of employees, that they have to keep that piece in mind. So in terms of incorporating the company and registering a name, so you can register a company under a name, under a number. The name that you register your company doesn't have to be your commercial name. Those can be two different subjects. You must always check that the name is not used already in the register, a company register. And if you decide to incorporate your company in Quebec, you need to make sure that the name of the company doesn't have a meaning only in English. I'll give you an example. One of my clients specialized in nuclear dismantling. And so dismantling and decommissioning. So the name of the company is NUDEC. NUDEC meaning nuclear decommissioning. So that's the name they use in France, that's the name they use in Europe, and they're under the name NUDEC, but they don't use on a regular, they never use the fact that the meaning of the name. So they incorporated in Quebec, and they've sent the name, and the name NUDEC, which sounds like nothing much. So the people of the register ask us if there was a meaning to NUDEC, and we say, oh yes, it's a nucléaire décommissionnement. And they say, oh no, in French, you will never say nucléaire décommissionnement, you will say décommissionnement nucléaire. And then they say, it's because in English you say nuclear decommissioning. So that's why the name of your company is Nudec. And we say, well, yeah, okay, kind of. And so they were not able to incorporate the company under Nudec because someone at the register decided that, you know, nucléaire décommissionnement does not make sense in French. It should be DECNU, décommissionnement nucléaire. So it doesn't seem much, but you know, when you create a company, you have an image as a company. It's always a little bit of a struggle when they don't let you incorporate your company under the name you wanted to. Then for commercial purposes, you can use a different name and they are able to use Nudec, but not for administrative reason in the Quebec register. So just want to illustrate how it can be a little bit challenging sometimes. Yes, so a few things that you have to do when you incorporate a business in Canada. The first one is that you have to claim a VAT taxes number. And again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but again, in Canada, 2 levels of government, federal, provincial, so 2 levels of tax. So you have the GST, which is a federal tax, and that tax is 5%, and the tax applies to everybody across Canada the same. And then you have the provincial tax, and the provincial tax is different in terms of name and in terms of percentage for every provinces. So it goes from 0% in Alberta, where there is no provincial taxes on the sales of goods, up to, I think the highest one must be 15, no, sorry. The highest one must be 7% in Quebec. Sorry, I should know that. I just have a blank. I think it's 7% in Quebec, but in Quebec, they calculate the tax on the good already taxed with the federal tax. So meaning that if you have something that costs 100, the tax in Quebec is not 7, it's 1 of 5. So 100 plus the 5% of the federal tax times 7%. So they're taxing the tax, which is kind of weird, but that's what they do. And in the other provinces, if it's 5%, it's 5% of the 100, not 5% of the 105. So anyway, just to tell you that, you know, like everything in Canada, because of the different level of government, it just add a little layer of difficulty and understanding, which has proven to create some issue with some companies that, for example, are doing some software where in the software you have a dimension of billing. So let's say one of your members is doing some system for I don't know, billing of freight for the railway. You need to make sure that your system is able to incorporate the fact that there are 2 levels of tax, that those levels of tax are different from one province to the next and are sometimes calculated differently from one province to the next. So it can affect some people in their business. I think that's always interesting because it's always shocking for some European people, but for business, definitively, and for personal everyday use, taxes are never shown in the price. So if you go to a store and you buy a pencil and that pencil costs $2, the real price is $2 plus the tax. So it's always the price without tax. So you go to the restaurant, you order your meal, you say, oh, okay, it's $20 for a steak, it's not bad, but then you have to add the tax, so 13% in Ontario, 15% in Quebec, and then you have to add another 15 or 18% for the tip to the waitress. So the $20 become much more money, and it's always a little bit of a shock for people coming from Europe. So yeah, please keep in mind that prices, business and retail, are never shown with taxes included. So the taxes are the responsibility in terms of collection of the seller, of the supplier. And if you don't collect your tax properly, it's a director liability. So that's something that needs to be done properly. In terms of tax, so I've mentioned federal, provincial. There is some provinces that have decided to harmonize their taxes, so they include the provincial and the federal in one unit tax. It's called the HST, it's the harmonized sales tax, and that's 13%, and that's what is being used in Ontario, for example. And then the next thing is you have to obviously open a bank account. So that can be, I'm not going to say difficult, but as much as it's easy to incorporate a company and can be done in 3 to 4 days, often what takes the most time, it's the process of opening a bank account. The bank in Canada are very careful when they open a bank for a subsidiary of a foreign company. They want to make sure there is no money laundering involved. So they ask for a lot of documents, and often they will ask the person the owner to come in person to come and sign the paper to officially open the bank account. So we sometimes in my company are being named as director of the company for a few months, just for the time that we can sign those documents ourselves. But yeah, they will require that someone comes in person to sign those documents. So that creates sometimes a little bit of a delay in starting the operation. In terms of applicable laws, again, it would be too simple if it was the same thing everywhere. So typically you have 2 sets of laws in Canada, and the main one for all the English-speaking Canada, it's common law. But in Quebec, they have a hybrid system between common law and code civil code. And the civil code in Quebec is very, very close from what is the French civil code. But so therefore bring another level of, again, it's nothing major, but a little level of complexity with having 2 different set of laws in the country. But the civil code, I should clarify that it's really impact more the private law. When we talk about more public law, it's more portion to common law. I talked about the language extensively before. You have to understand that in Quebec, there is something that's called the Charter of the French Language, which is kind of a law by itself, and that detail all the rules regarding the use of French language in commerce and business, and has been reinforced, as I mentioned, a couple of weeks ago by Bill 96. And really, I give you an example, but if in a business you're using a software and that software is in English, if there is an equivalent software in French, they can force you to switch software and to start using the software in French rather than the software in English. So they do take that very seriously in Quebec, and please make sure you understand it from the beginning and that you incorporate those obligations from the very beginning when you start a business in Canada, especially if you have some activity in Quebec. One of the things that's very a bit reassuring is that, contrary to the US, where there are some exemplary sentences, there is none in Canada, and typically the sentence is always proportional to the prejudice. So you can just get some crazy amount of money that are being awarded to the complainant. It has always to be linked to the prejudice. Just a quick note about websites and .ca domain. To be able to use a .ca domain, you need to have some type of activity or presence in Canada. You cannot just decide from somewhere in the UK or Sweden that you open a .ca website and without having any type of presence in Canada. And just because I didn't know where to put that else in my presentation, in terms of payment period, typically in Canada, people are paying at 30 days after receipt of the invoice. That's what's the most typical in Canada. Any question on that fairly important subject of creating a subsidiary in Canada?
There's one question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Irina. May I ask?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't hear who's speaking, but go ahead.
It's Irina speaking. I want to ask you regarding the labor force in Canada. For example, in US market, let's say it's not so loyal. All employees are not so loyal, and often they change their their workplace. Let's say how it is in Canada. So are they used to change the places, to change their work, or they are more stable? And in this thing, how it is in Canada?
As bad. It's as bad. I will talk about it a bit later, but first of all, you have to understand that a typical notice of resignation is 2 weeks. So it doesn't take, like I know in France, for example, typically it's 3 months. Here in Canada, it's 2 weeks. So it goes very fast. And so people can resignate and be gone the next day. And, you know, sometimes they don't even do their 2 weeks. And it's very difficult to enforce in any case. So, I mean, I experience that turnaround a lot because I work with with SMEs from Europe in many different industries. You know, when I talk to someone, for example, in the food industry, and so I'm looking for an importer or distributor for them, and then I talk to someone in that same company 2 years later, I would say that there is 60 to 70% of chance that the person I used to talk to 2 years ago is not in the company anymore. So the turnaround is crazy, and it's even more crazy now with the COVID, and it's super difficult to find some human resources right now in Canada, especially in Montreal and Toronto. And one of the big challenge for the companies is to find some, you know, different way, not only to attract people, but to keep them on staff. That's a real challenge. So they're starting to do a lot of different things, like, you know, paying for some benefits, like additional health insurance, having some people coming in the company to help them, flexible hours, anything you can imagine to be able to keep people on staff. So It's yeah, it's the same type of mentality than in the US. People have very little loyalty to their employer, and they will change very fast when they can get 5% increase in their salary or better condition or better role, whatever. But they will not think twice about changing job. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other question on creating a subsidiary? No. Okay. So once you've created your subsidiary, it's time potentially, especially I guess in your members' field of activity, to start protecting your intellectual property, because as I mentioned before, don't be overly confident with how nice Canadian look at first. In business, they can be sharks, and if there is an opportunity, they will jump onto it. So just make sure you protect yourself with contract, with your IP, with your trademarks, with your patents, with your industrial design. Make sure everything is done properly. I must admit I'm not a big expert on IP because it can be a little bit of a challenging subject. We typically use an agent who specializes in that. That's what is highly recommended in Canada, is to use an agent to help you with all those different subjects. But everything related to intellectual property is managed by an office named CIPO, so the Canadian Intellectual Property Office. So things are pretty clear and straightforward as long as you do what has to be done. So yeah, I don't know if you have a question on that. Again, I'm not a great expert in that field, but just make sure your members are covering themselves. Canada is part of a few international treaty convention. So the PCT, the Madrid Protocol, Hague System. And again, I can only insist on the fact that once you come to Canada, make sure that when you... And sorry, I'm just going to take maybe an example to illustrate, because I have a client that was convinced that when he deposited his patent in Europe, that it was also covering the Canadian market, but he had not done all the process through the PCT, and therefore when he came to Canada, he was actually not covered. So thanks we addressed that issue. We double checked with his lawyer in Europe, and then we made the necessary step. But it's very important that you double check, especially if you have some type of IP. Make sure that your members always get some NDA signed when they start exchanging information. So yeah, cover yourself on your IP. That's all I can say. So employers and employees. So typically a normal work week in Canada is 40 hours, 8 hours per day. One of the things that's pretty challenging when you come from a European system, and for myself from the French system, where we have there is a reputation for having quite a lot of vacation, is that when you start a new job in Canada, you're only entitled to 2 weeks of vacation. And it's only after 5 consecutive years at the same employer that you can be entitled to a 3rd week of vacation annually. So that's not a lot, and it does also explain why people are typically at the office from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5, but at 5 don't expect to find many people in the offices. Some execs are definitively, but most of the people are leaving at 5, and nobody is really expecting them to do overtime, except if it's requested and it's paid overtime. But when it's time, and it's really explained by the fact that when you don't have much vacation, you do the best with your spare time. One of the things you always have to be careful, and especially when you have a subsidiary and you don't have a lot of staff yet, and so you start working with contractors, you need to make sure that you have your contract with your contractor in a way that it makes it very clear that there is no employer-employee relation, because if there is, you can become responsible for paying some taxes for your reputed employee, even if it's not on your payroll. But if it's determined that the relation is an employee-employer relation, you're going to be forced to pay some taxes, and they can go back if they consider that the situation has lasted for 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. The way the salary is paid in Canada, you always get your salary net, and it's the employer responsibility to pay for unemployment, for all the different contribution that need to be done. So yeah, unemployment is the main one, but also a pension plan and so on. And the main one being obviously the income tax. So when you get your salary, you get it net of tax, and at the end of the year you do your fiscal declaration, your income declaration, and typically, thanks to some mechanism, you do tend to get some money back from the government rather than having to pay some income tax at the end of the year, because your income tax has been paid all the year long. And so the last point does address what you were asking before, but yeah, it's super easy to end a work contract. It's super easy not only for the employee, but also for the employer. And typically, an employer is able to tell you on the Friday night, you don't need to come back on Monday morning. So they will pay you your 2 weeks of notice, but it's very rare that when someone is fired in Canada, that the employer will ask the person to come and do the 2 last weeks. Typically, they'll fire you, they give you your money, and they don't want to see you anymore. And that can be a little bit, for people coming from Europe especially, that can be a little bit of a shock, because I've seen it in companies where a person is fired at the end of the day, and they bring someone from security to your desk, you grab your personal stuff, and you're being escorted to the door, and that's it. And that's kind of, wow, I've been with that company for 10 years, and I'm being fired. I'm going to get my compensation, but then they bring someone from security to bring me to my desk to the door. Even so, I haven't done anything. It's just the way it is. It's just because they don't want you to live with I don't know, with a computer, or with some data, or with a Fire Stick or whatever. So that's done on a regular basis in larger company, which can be somehow a little bit shocking. So something that's you have to know is that Canada has one of the most educated workforce in the world. Almost 60% of Canadians between 25 and 64 are graduated from post-secondary institution, meaning a college or university. And also what you have to understand here is that a lot of the workforce in Canada is coming from international exchange or immigration. And when it comes to immigration, Canada has what they call selective immigration. So typically they will select people to immigrate that have the competency and the education that they're looking for. So it's really based on what type of specific skills they're looking for, and that's how they're going to drive their immigration. Sorry. Any more question on that employer-employee relation? No. So I'll move on to the next slide. Tax incentives. So I think that could be of interest to a lot of your members. So there are a number of, there's not a ton of tax incentive in Canada, but there is a big one which is called SHRED, and it's a tax incentive on scientific research and experimental development, so basically on R&D. So there is a federal program, and there are provincial programs. Those provincial programs are different from one province to the next again. So depending on what you do, what is your field of research or development, it's always a good idea before you start your subsidiary to choose the best province where you can get the best tax incentive for your program. So to be able to benefit from those tax incentives, obviously, you need to incorporate in Canada. Again, either federal or provincial, doesn't matter what and where, but you need to have a company incorporated in Canada to be able to benefit from those tax incentives. And they are pretty interesting to an extent that they are comparable to what you can find on market like France, like Brazil. Canada is right there in terms of tax incentive on R&D. And then you have to be also depending on how many jobs you're planning to create when you open your subsidiary. It's always a good idea to put in competition the different economic development agency in the different provinces, because even if it's not a tax incentive or a tax break, those people will put a lot of resource on the table to attract your company if they believe it's a benefit for the province. So there is quite a lot of competition between the province when it's time to attract a company. So it's always a good idea to try to leverage that as much as possible. So I'm going to jump now into more culture and practices in business. But before I move into that, again, if you have a question regarding everything related to incorporation of a subsidiary and how to run a subsidiary in Canada. No, okay. So culture and practices. So first thing, the business card. Business card is part of how to do business in Canada. Everybody has business card. What is probably a little bit different is that typically a business card has two sides. One side that is in English, one side is in French, and depending who you're talking to, you will flip your card and give the right one, the right side to your contact, depending if it's French speaking or English speaking. When someone gives you their business card, they're expecting you to have a look at it and to take care of the business card. And one thing I'm going to talk about a lot later, it's how important is networking in Canada when it comes time to do business. And so because networking is so important, business card is, definitely one of the means to have something to exchange, or at least to have. Sorry, I'm looking for a word, but doesn't matter. It's always a good idea to be able to exchange business card, because it's really part of that networking environment, and it's big. Dress code. So it really depends on the industry and the level in the hierarchy, but typically it's business casual. It's typically way more relaxed than it is in Europe, and I would say that, you know, a Canadian SME or striving to Canada, come for the first meeting, the expectation it will be for them to wear a suit and a dress shirt. The tie is really not necessary, except maybe if you're going to meet some financial institution, but besides that, the tie is becoming very rare in Canada. But a suit and the dress shirt as a first meeting, probably what makes the more sense. But you also have to adapt to your meeting, right? If your product is steel manufacturing and you're going to meet with a partner, you know, a suit and a dress shirt when the people are wearing some working clothes might be a bit too much. So I guess it's like everywhere. You need to adapt to who you're talking to. But as a rule of thumb, and to make it simple, a suit and a dress shirt works. In winter, it's always interesting when you get to a company to see that there is a lot of winter shoes in the entrance. People typically have 2 pairs of shoes, one for in the street and 1 pair for when they get to the office. There is something that's, I would say, not very design, but a lot of people are using. It's called clack. It's like a rubber. It's like a rubber shoe that you put on top of your existing shoe, and it protects from not only the snow, but more importantly, it protects your shoes from the salt, because they put a ton of salt in the street, especially on the sidewalk. So it's if you want your pair of shoes to last more than 1 year, it's always a good idea to have some clack part of your attire when you go to work. Perfumes are banned in some workplaces, and in any case, the expectation is for it to be very light. So yeah, it's I guess, again, like just what makes sense, but there is some sensitivity to it, and allergies in general, and in Canada are pretty developed. Food allergy there is a high percentage of the people with food allergy and with perfume allergy as well, apparently. So yeah, just refrain on being overly perfumed. Meeting. So when you should organize a meeting? So again, as I mentioned before, typically a work day is from 8 or 9 to 5. And so people are taking about a 30-minute break to it. A lot of people are eating at their desk, especially in the winter, where it's not super exciting to go for a walk outside. And so when you organize a meeting, try to organize your meeting anywhere between 9 and noon and from 1 to 3 p.m. Try to avoid late afternoon meetings. As I mentioned before, people typically, when it's 5 p.m., they leave the office. So starting a meeting at 4:30, people, are not very excited about the idea. But yeah, you can start early and go all the way to mid-afternoon, and it's fine to start a meeting at 4, but don't send a meeting request for 5 p.m. You're going to have a hard time having people accepting that. In terms of how to obtain a meeting? So as I mentioned, networking is big. So any reference you will have, any connections that can facilitate will definitely help in getting a meeting. As an overall statement, please understand that getting a meeting in Canada is fairly easy. You can have meeting with execs at large company relatively. It's relatively easy. The challenge becomes more getting the second appointment, meaning that when you do the first one, you have to be very well prepared, and that you need to make a great impression. So it could be more challenging to have a second meeting than the first meeting with someone in Canada, which is maybe a little bit counterintuitive. The meeting itself, and I can't insist enough, but punctuality is very highly valued in Canada. You don't come late to a meeting. You don't connect late to a Team or Zoom call. And if you have an issue, you're stuck in traffic, your previous meeting was longer than expected, doesn't matter what the reason is, if you're late, you have to make sure that you send a message to the person, either talk to them in person, send them an email, have someone that relays the information, but you need to make sure. Otherwise, people will not appreciate that at all. So again, punctuality is very valued, and a 1 hour meeting is typically 1 hour, meaning that sometimes you plan a meeting and in the calendar you put from 10 to 11, and the expectation is that, oh well, if that meeting goes well and we have some more, we'll keep on going until noon. In Canada, if it's from 10 to 11, at 11, your counterpart is expecting the meeting to end because they've probably planned something else and they didn't leave any buffer. So punctuality, time management, very important in meetings. Typically, the way you start a meeting, again, handshake for a man or woman, exchange business card, and then there is often a little bit of small talk before jumping into the subject. So, 2-3 minutes where you talk about, as I mentioned before, the weather. Talking about sports is always a good idea. Hockey, baseball, basketball. If your only reference in sport is a German soccer championship, it's probably not a good idea, and they probably won't relate to it very much. But hockey, baseball, basketball are good subject. And so those small talks are always a great icebreaker, and that's what is expected, and that's how a meeting typically starts. There is some pride in Canadians in where they live, not only in terms of the country they live in, but the province or the city they live in. So it's always nice to compliment them about, Toronto, Montreal, what a nice city. I love the province of Quebec. Whatever you say, people are always quite sensitive to that. In terms of the naming, definitively people call each other by their first name all the time. Depending on the level, executive level, you might have people who use last name, but it's very rare. But so in any case, let your Canadian counterpart to engage with that. And if they call you John right away, you can say, nice meeting you, Bill. I mean, you can use the first name right away, and you introduce yourself. You can introduce yourself. I am Jan. Nice meeting you. That works very well. So the meeting itself and presentation in general. presentation should be short and clear. And it's very important to use facts and figures. And that's kind of also part of the go-to-market strategies that we'll talk about a bit later. But you have, and I think as European, it's very important to understand, but you have to simplify your offer as much as possible and only talk, at least at the beginning, only talk to your counterpart of the part of your offer that matters to them. I know in Europe, we tend to overcomplicate stuff. It's part of the culture. We like to make it complicated, so it sounds more rich, more intellectual. But in Canada, what you want to do, you want it very simple, straight to the point for people to understand right away what is it you're trying to sell to them or what is it you want to do with them. Okay, so keep it simple. The other thing that's very important is that, and I have seen it too many times, is people coming with a deck of presentation and all the references, everything is in the European context. The name of the client, the references in the cities. So, you know, if you don't have clients in North America, you don't. But if you're trying to explain that your product is very well suited for some railway, a train manufacturer, it's better that you choose Bombardier as a reference rather than companies that only operate in Europe. And even if it's not a reference in terms of client, but for them to understand who are your clients, who are you talking to, what is it you're trying to sell. So again, make sure you Canadianize as much as possible your presentation. Another example for in Canada, even so, we have adopted the metric system 20 years ago, I think now. In many industries, it's still the imperial system that's being used. So if you have a presentation where it says, oh, look, I'm using a thickness of steel that's 5 millimeters, well, make sure also that it says 5 millimeters or 3/8 of an inch, because by doing that, the person in front of you, they will click right away. They know what you talk about. It talks to them. They relate to it. So very important, again, simplify and relate to your Canadian counterpart. The other thing is don't oversell, don't exaggerate. It's not part of the culture. People here will understand. You have to keep it honest in the presentation, and that's what they appreciate. Agreements can be reached very quickly. From my experience, I find that in Ontario, sales cycles are always a little bit faster than in Quebec, and I think in BC it's even faster. So agreements can be agreed upon fairly quickly, but then there is always, or you should at least always ask for some written agreement under the form of a contract. And if you have some contract of your own, make sure that it's being reviewed by a lawyer in Canada for the contract to adapt to the legislation in Canada, and make sure it's possible to have it enforced locally. Another thing that's very important is that Canadians have a very hard time to say no, and they don't like too much disagreement. They don't manage it super well. So what that means is that if they're not interested, instead of saying no to you very clearly, they will let the time pass and they will drag on until you kind of give up and say, okay, I guess he's not interested. But it's not very easy to have a clear answer when it's a no. You have a clear answer when it's a yes, but it's always difficult to judge if it's lack of interest, lack of time. So you have to be you know, keep on pushing, because it's also a way for them to see if you're looking at the Canadian market just as an option or if you're serious about the market. So until you have a no, you should keep going, but please keep in mind that having a no can be difficult. And at the end of the day, anyway, the company wants to have a yes. To avoid, and I'm going to insist on that, jokes can be very different from the type of jokes we have in Europe and that we have in Canada. So even if you have a great sense of humor, just refrain on that. Sexist jokes are not appreciated here. It's not very common to do sexist joke, at least in a business environment. Avoid any joke, especially if you come from France or the UK, joke on accent or expression from the French language or the English language. That can go sideways as well sometimes. So yeah, and political discussion, people don't share their political view too much. So yeah, especially if you're new to the country and you don't understand the system, it's better to refrain on those subjects. When it comes to gift, there is really no need and no culture of exchanging gift in a business relation, especially at the very beginning. If you sign a major contract or a major partnership, maybe that makes sense, but gifts are not part of the business culture, and nobody will expect you to bring a gift, or don't expect a gift from anybody. Meals, business meals. So there's typically 3 times in the day where you can have a business meeting around a meal. Breakfast, and that's a pretty big one actually, and I don't think it's very common in Europe, but having a business meeting around a breakfast is a pretty interesting option. First of all, because typically it's easy and fast, and your counterpart can meet you at your hotel, for example, if you're traveling. It's a good option to maximize the number of meetings you can do in a day, because you can start fairly early. And people will typically have a continental brunch with eggs, hash browns, orange juice. So that's what people will do. So consider breakfast as a possibility. Lunch is also definitively a possibility to have a business meal. And in Canada, a lunch can be easily expedited in 1 hour. So you can have a business meal around lunch and keep it 1 hour. Restaurants are used to that. They're pretty efficient, and people will come in, come out, and that can work. Dinner will come in a second time when you have created a more intimate relation with a partner, a client, or a supplier. It's not something you will do in a first meeting. Definitely not something you will do in a first meeting. Another good way, or a great way to do business is to have a meeting on a golf course. But it takes one prerequisite, is that you have to know how to play some golf, at least a little bit. What's great is that, if you have someone who's going to be with you for 4 hours, so it's a great way to have a discussion, to create a relation. So that's always a pretty good option. In meeting, French and English, depending where you are, but in Quebec, Most of the business people are able to communicate in English. Some member of their team might not. So a lot of the meetings are jumping from one language to the next. So you just need to be ready for that. If you're in Quebec, make sure that you have a little bit of documentation, a few words that you can use in French. And for the French-speaking European, same when you go to Ontario, on the other hand, or in BC, don't expect to have anybody able to speak in French with you. You will have to be ready to have the meeting 100% in English. Post-meeting, do your follow-up. That's the expectation. You have to clarify what was discussed. You have to clarify what are the next steps. And then you have to follow up on the next steps. That's your responsibility as a supplier, and assuming that most of your members are coming as suppliers. It's your responsibility as a supplier to do the follow-up. Don't expect the your Canadian counterpart to take care of that. Again, I've seen it many times where my clients go to a meeting, come back out of the meeting and say, yeah, that was a great meeting. I think we're going to have an order next week. That's the way Canadians are. That's where they're very good at. It's to make you feel very comfortable. They will put you in a position where you think, oh, wow, great, we're going to move forward. But then it can pass days, weeks, months before they give you an answer to anything and before you make your first sale. So keep that in mind. You're going to avoid disappointment. Any questions, any comments? No? So I'll keep moving on. Yeah.
Thank you, because it's really interesting and very complete. Thank you.
You're welcome. So was that a question or a comment?
Oh, it's a comment.
Okay. So thank you for that nice comment, Amélie. I appreciate it. Yeah, so in terms of negotiation now, usually Canadians will keep their emotion to a check. Don't be aggressive. Don't try to negotiate too hard. That's not the style. Again, you will see the relation is very friendly, and you need to get to the point in your discussion. And I was mentioning before that the market is quite segmented, and you will see some very big difference in the type of doing negotiation between big cities and especially between Montreal, Toronto, which is pretty fast-paced, and for example, Vancouver and BC, where it's way more laid back, people take their time. So different approach, and you will have to adapt based on where you are in Canada and or you talk to. Negotiation will always be limited to on the price, especially to a few percentage. But don't start and, for example, go in Canada, give a price and say, okay, we'll see if they accept, but I can drop it down by 50–40%. If you start doing that, you will not be considered serious anymore. The maximum fluctuation you should have on a price to sound someone serious will be really being max 20%, but I will say anything above 10% can jeopardize how people consider you. Yeah, I think the rest we've pretty much covered already. Yeah, in terms of management, that's an interesting one. So in Canada, the hierarchy is pretty flat. In any extent, it's much flatter than what it can be in most of the European countries. And there is a very easy access for the employees to their boss. I'm just going to illustrate by it's a personal example, but my wife is Canadian, and for a little while we've lived in France, and she was working for a consulting firm in the audit industry, so like a Deloitte. And here in Canada, when they were going to work on a project, you know, they were going at a client, and for lunch, the associate, and she was at an early stage of her career, so she was just a junior manager. And so the partners, senior manager, junior manager, everybody was going for lunch together, and it was very open discussion, and they always had a great time over meals. And then she came to France. She got transferred from Deloitte Canada to Deloitte in Lyon. And she goes on her first mandate. They go to the client, and for lunch, she realized that the partner goes and they have lunch together, that the senior manager go to have lunch together, and that the junior are just being left by themselves, and they can only have lunch among themselves. So it just to illustrate the relations that can exist in companies, and the fact that it's much flatter and a much easier access for the employee to their boss. So that's really part of the culture. In terms of communication, email is definitively the preferred mean of communication over phone. I have a lot of examples of people here in Canada who will look at their emails all day long during meetings and will look at their email and answer, but will only listen to their voicemail once a day at the end of the day. This being said, if you send a first email, a second email, a third email, and you don't have an answer, that's when you take your phone and you call them, because as much as I've said before, they don't like to say no. They won't say no in an email, or they're just going to ignore your email. If you have the people over the phone, you can, push them a little bit and get a better answer from them. And sometimes you can twist their arm a little bit and get a meeting, or get a second meeting, or get some more information. So again, email is preferred, but do not hesitate to jump on a call if you have no answer of your second or third email. Women in business, that's also a very important. In Canada, there are a lot of women at every level of business, on boards, in exec position. The parity, I won't say there is a parity yet, but we're getting there. Right now in Canada, there are more women coming out of university every year than there is men. So we can expect that trend to continue and to have a lot of women at the exec positions. There already are a lot of women at exec position, but more and more, that's what we should see in the coming years, which is, I think, a great thing. And I not only say that because I've noticed there is a lot of women today. I really believe it. Yeah, so most of that I think we've covered. I'm just looking if there is something I should have mentioned here. Yeah, maybe something, and it's more for the French speaking. In France we use vous in business relation. I know it's changing a little bit, but it's still what happens the most here. In Quebec, people will say tu right away. and they will look very open. After 1 hour of a meeting with someone, it's business or personal, you're going to feel like you met your best friend forever. But in business, please understand that it's a business relation only. And I know it can be pretty deceiving, but that's what it is. That's just the way Canadians are. They are extremely friendly during those meetings. There is no barrier, very open, but it's a business relation and a business relation only. So make sure your member keeps that in mind, because it does affect the way people feel and react to it. Yes, that's an important subject. Actually, I want to talk about.
Sorry, it means that we have to say tu directly, or we wait them to say tu and after we do it like for the first name.
Yeah, so I will wait for them to say tu, but as soon as they say tu, I will say tu as well. Because if you keep saying vous, it's kind of perceived as, you know, being you trying to distance yourself from the person, trying to be a little bit snobby. French people have a reputation in Quebec to be to have a superiority complex. Same for the people from the UK in Ontario. So humility is very important, and so as soon as they say tu, you have to engage with the tu as well. As soon as they use your first name, use their first name as well. Yeah, that's what you should do. To be the first one to use tu will work as well, but at the end of the day, what I find, and even now I've been for over 20 years in Canada, there are some situations, some people I talk to, that even after all those years, the vous comes more naturally for me. And so I will start with the vous, and if the person switch to the tu, I will switch to the tu, but if they don't, or if it's not very clear, I will sometimes stay with the vous, just because that's so deep in our culture, that it's not. Don't overforce yourself. But again, if they open with the tu, you should follow with the tu.
Okay. Thanks.
And I have another question, Guido speaking. I would like to know, is it maybe useful to ask if we can raise the question using tu instead of vous, or it has to be natural just because they are starting, and then we have to ask the permission to use the tu or not?
No, if they use it, don't. If they don't use it, and you feel like it's because they are the one who are trying to matching you, because that's what happens sometimes, right? You're coming and the people in front of you, they know about the vous, so they want to be polite, they want to put you at ease, so they're the one that they use the vous, but it's not natural for them. They just do that to put you at comfort. In that instance, yes, definitely you should say, do you mind if we say tu? And they will have a big smile on their face and say, oh yes, please. But if they go with the tu, no, go with the tu. You don't need to ask any permission.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, one of a very important subject that I want to address here is price and ROI. I know that in Europe, often we wait for the very last moment, or even during the first meeting, we try to avoid to talk about cost and price. We want to talk about everything else, and then when we know for sure that the person is interested, then we start talking about price. In Canada, it can be one of the very first questions, and sometimes it's a bit surprising because you're not even sure that the people have fully understood your offer, that they already ask a question about the price. So you want to go all the way and keep your way of negotiating, but please be prepared, know what to answer, and have some figures ready for them, because they're going to be frustrated if they ask about the price and you don't give them any answer, even if it's not, you can give them just a budget, you don't have to give a final price, but you have at least to give some sense of what it's going to cost. That's the expectation. So you need to be prepared on that. And it can come very early in the discussion and in the meeting. The other thing is, people think short ROI. The return on investment is a very big component in a lot of the project in Canada, and you can have a lot of arguments about saying, yeah, but if you buy that pen, it's twice the price, but it's going to last you 10 years, and it's so much nicer, and blah blah and blah blah. At the end of the day, if they don't see any ROI using that pen, they're going to use a pen that's twice cheaper. And even if that pen is going to end up in the garbage after 2 years instead of 10, because a lot of the reasoning is based on short ROI. That's, I don't want to make it a generality, and sometimes it doesn't apply the way I'm just saying it now, but short ROI is definitively what drives the business here in Canada. And finally, I just want to go back to that very, very important point. As I often say, there is 3 things you have to remember when you do business in Canada. It's networking, networking, and networking. So as you deploy in the country, you really need to understand very well your business environment. You need to get involved in association, in cluster. And I mean, you understand the value of it, everybody today. But, you come to Canada, one of the first things your members should do is say, oh, does my cluster back in Europe has any connection with a cluster in Canada? And if yes, I should go meet those people and go to some of their events and start meeting people and start building my network, because that's the way business is done. Networking here is not considered as being I'm sorry, I'm totally bugging on the word. Anyway, it's not considered being rude. Like, sometimes in Europe, the perception of just doing networking for networking is not always very well appreciated. Here, it's really how business should be done. And you go to an event and you will be, it's sometimes surprising. Someone will come to you, shake your hand, say, hey, I'm John. And what is it you do in life? And you say, hey, I'm Jan, I'm a consultant. Or you're not working in a financial institution. No, I'm not. Oh, okay, it was nice meeting you. And they leave, and that's it. And nobody is offended by that. They just do networking to do networking, and they try, when they go to an event, they try to find who has the right contact for them, and they don't waste any time with people who can bring them any value. So it's yeah, it's just the way it is. So that's in an event setting, but beyond that, you have to leverage all possible means of networks that you can. Networking is really the best way to do business in Canada, 100%.